Very good. Well, let's begin. Theology 1, the Doctrine of God. That's what we're doing. And later on, I will follow it up with a short lecture, one per week, of Doctrine of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and the Trinity as well. But for the moment, we'll just do the general Doctrine of God. So let us, this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to introduce everyone to the theology and doctrine of God, and then 2 through 5 will come as separate lectures later on individually, as we focus in on those aspects of the Godhead and the Trinity. So I've got 6 lessons in a bibliography on this one, and so we'll go through them. I expect that I'll only get through the existence of God, all the arguments for and against that, in this lesson, and then we'll see how far we go with the knowledge of God, the nature and so on, and all the attributes of God as we go along. I've also included that lesson number 6 about the names of God, because not many people go into that. We know about Elohim, Yahweh, Adonai, which is the name of the office, and so on. There are many more. So we'll go into that as we get there. But first of all, before we can talk about God, we need to know about lesson 1. Does he exist? How can we be sure? What evidence do we have about all that? Well, on January the 7th in 1855, there was a young 20-year-old minister of New Park Street Baptist Church in Southwark in London, and he opened his morning address like this. It has been said by someone that the proper study of mankind is man. I will not oppose the idea, but I believe it's equally true that the proper study of God's elect is God. The proper study of a Christian is the Godhead. The highest science, the loftiest speculation, the mightiest philosophy, which can ever engage the attention of a child of God, is the name, the nature, the person, the work, the doings, and the existence of the great God, whom he calls his Father. Very profound statement, that. And that really is the backdrop to what we're going to be doing. So we're going to take an overview and go into some of the aspects of the Godhead that the young man mentioned there. I did know his name, but I've forgotten it and I didn't write it down there, so do forgive me on that one. So any study of theology must have it as its beginning a study of God. And Charles Ryrie, the great theologian, says that unquestionably the knowledge of God is desirable. The religious yearnings of mankind attest to that, but is it possible? One little aside here, quotations like that from Ryrie, in the notes that I'll be posting to go along with this lecture, you'll find all the references to the writings and the page numbers and whatever I've got these things from. But it's too much to go into here, and I don't want to distract anyone. But the references will be available in the notes when I post them. So that's what he says. Is it possible? The very word theology comes from the Greek word theos, meaning God, and logos, meaning word or a systematic discourse or explanation. Jesus is the logos, isn't he? Jesus is the word, and he is the systematic explanation and reason for the entire universe. He was there in the beginning, he'll be there at the end, and he's certainly around throughout the middle piece. Therefore, theology is a complete discourse about God. Theos and logos, a combined word. So now, theology is a very wide term, and it covers the entire field of Christian belief. The study of Christ, the Holy Spirit, the Old Testament prophets, eschatology, angels, and so on. However, the term used of the study of God the Father is known as theology proper, because God is, as a unity, the author and finisher of our faith and the creator of the entire universe. For the Christian, the knowledge of God is essential. But how do we know there is a God? There are several arguments that attempt to prove and disprove the existence of God. And that's what we're going to go through now before we go on to the rest of it. So, arguments for the existence of God. That's our first section. A, the cosmological argument. And again, the word cosmological, I mean, comes from cosmos, meaning world, and logos, meaning word or systematic discourse. And this argument, I'll explain this sentence in a moment. This argument is inductive and a posteriori, based on the fact that a cosmos or a world exists. We take the facts of existence and reason from there to a conclusion. The word inductive means exactly what I've just said. You look at the facts and you reason from the facts to a conclusion of understanding. A posteriori means after the fact. So basically, you're looking at the world, it exists. So after the fact, we're looking at that and we're reasoning from there to a conclusion. I've given you the big words there because it's important. If people start bandying theological words about, you understand what they mean. So an inductive argument, you argue from a measured or observed set of data and you argue towards a conclusion. And a posteriori means after the fact. A priori means before the fact, but that's something else. Okay, cosmological argument. Simply stated, the argument is everything that has a beginning must have an adequate cause, right? Everything that has a beginning must have an adequate cause. Now, because something cannot come from nothing, there must be an original cause that is the reason for the existence of the world or the cosmos. And that cause, we believe, is God. And we take that from Hebrews chapter 3, verse 4. For every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God. Now, that is very convincing to a Christian who believes in the Bible. But if we look at people who don't believe in the Bible, they won't take that as part of the proof. We need to go a bit deeper into it, and we will eventually. But let's just carry on for the moment and look at a different argument, which is the teleological argument. And again, I've explained the derivation of the word there. The teleological argument, is inductive and a posteriori, so it's after the fact. And it comes from the Greek words telos, meaning end, and logos, meaning word or systematic discourse. So we're looking at the entire round of history. Now, Charles Thiessen sums it up. Order and useful arrangement in a system imply intelligence and purpose in the organizing cause. The universe is characterized by order and useful arrangement. Therefore, the universe has an intelligent and free cause. There we are. So we're developing the arguments now, cosmological, teleological. We're carrying on with that argument just for the moment. The world everywhere demonstrates intelligence, purpose, and harmony. And there must be a master architect behind it all. I mean, for example, you've all heard a lot about DNA now, and you know about the double helix and how complex it is. And it's the most condensed form of knowledge, of data storage that we know in the universe. And our best supercomputers can't come anywhere close to it. Yeah, and so for something like that to exist, and within it, there are instructions for all the different machines that go up and down DNA strands, operating on them and making proteins and so on. And the instructions for those machines are in the DNA. So which came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, the answer is it all had to be there from the beginning, all at once, or nothing would work. So there must be a master architect behind it all. And the psalmist sees the magnificence of God's creation and recognizes that it is all a witness to God's existence. Psalm 8 verses 3 and 4 and Psalm 19 verses 1 to 4. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord. We all know those psalms. Now, God's designed harmony is observable throughout the world and the universe. The earth, the sun, the moon are all in perfect relationship. That's why the moon perfectly blanks off the sun during a total eclipse. And it's why the sun is an amazing regulated output within narrow limits. It's a variable star, Cepheid variable, the astronomers call it, and it's classed as a G2 star if you're familiar with this astronomical classifications. But the thing is, all the Cepheid variables in the universe have a very wide range of variability. The output gets really hot or very low. And if that were the case with our sun, then we would freeze on occasions and then fry. So it would be a freeze-fry cycle of existence, which would not allow life on Earth because it would be dead through freezing or through burning up. So it's self-regulating. The ecology of our biosphere is an integrated self-regulating system based on the fact that our variable sun is constrained within certain very narrow limits. And so the conclusion is that God, the master architect, has created the universe and everything in it. The alternative, that the world came into being from nothing and organized itself by random chance, is absolutely impossible. In fact, it's a contradiction in terms. I think you can all see that. So Moving on, we now got the anthropological argument. And the anthropological argument, again, I sort of break the word down. Anthropos in Greek means man. Logos, again, means word or systematic discourse. And so we have anthropological means looking at the existence of God from man's point of view, from the anthropological point of view. I don't know what's happened there. It's gone back. There we are. Now, in opposition to the secular humanist who sees man as a biological machine, the biblicist sees man as created in the image of God. And there are the references in Genesis, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. The image of God in man, let's be clear, is spiritual, not physical. God is pure spirit. He does not have a physical form. All right? He doesn't have a gender or sexuality or anything. The only thing you can say about God is he consistently represents himself as male throughout the whole of the Bible. But that's a wholly different argument. But the image of God in man is spiritual. Ephesians 4 and Colossians chapter 3. I'll leave you to look those up in your own time, but it just basically says what I've condensed in one sentence there. So the anthropological argument goes on because we're not simply a physical being, but also a moral being with a conscience. We have intellect, we have emotion, and we have will. Those are all attributes of God as well. That's why we are made it. That's why we can say we're made in the image of God. Now, Schaeffer, Louis Sperry Schaeffer, in his systematic theology, he says, quote, "There are philosophical and moral features in man's constitution which may be traced back to find their origin in God. A blind force could never produce a man with intellect, sensibility, will, conscience, and an inherent belief in a creator. Even though there are many different religions throughout the world, everybody, in every race, every culture, they seem to be looking for a divine origin or a divine moral code." Which brings us neatly to the moral argument for the existence of God. Now, the moral argument is related to the anthropological argument, and sometimes they are combined, and can be seen as a further development of the anthropological argument. Now, the moral argument is based on the fact that man has got an innate awareness of right and wrong, a sense of morality or conscience. The question is, where did this sense of moral justice or righteousness come from? It's a very interesting question, isn't it? If man is only a biological machine, why does a sense of morals exist? Moral standards and concepts can't come from any random evolutionary process. It's not possible to come from that. Randomness does not produce coherence. Now, morality assumes a pre-existing ethical order to which the human race is subject, even when we deliberately contravene it. In contrast to all of the animals on the planet, all of the creatures of any kind, we have a pre-existing assumption of an ethical order to which we are subjected to, and we are definitely subject to it without fail, without excuse, and without exception. In Romans 2, verses 14 and 15, it shows that Gentiles who have had no revelation of the law or the Bible have an inner moral witness placed there by God. And I'm just going to bring up that passage in Romans chapter 2. Let's just read that together. "For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them, in the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel." So that's very interesting. Even the people who haven't heard of Jesus or haven't heard of the law, they have a conscience. And if you obey it or if you don't obey it, Jesus will know at the end of time and he will judge accordingly. And so it's very interesting, isn't it? So we need to be aware not to be too judgmental about people who haven't heard of Jesus or haven't heard of the law or the gospel, because you never know who you're going to meet in heaven. And there are going to be some surprises. Anyway, that's an old story, but it's true. Continuing with the moral argument, Strong sums up the argument like this: conscience recognizes the existence of a moral law which has supreme authority. Known violations of this moral law are followed by feelings of ill desert and feelings of guilt and judgment, and we all feel out of sorts. And this moral law, since it's not self-imposed, and these threats of judgment, since they're not self-executing, moving on, respectively argue the existence of a holy will that has imposed the law and of a punitive power that will execute the threats of a moral nature. So that's how Strong sums it up. And Scripture appeals to this argument for proof of God's existence in Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 32, and chapter 2, 14 to 16, which we've just looked at. So that should have come up before. Let's move on. We now come to the ontological argument. And this is probably one of the most difficult. I think you can all follow what I've just said about the other arguments, but this one can be quite difficult. And it differs from the preceding arguments that it is not inductive, but deductive, and it's a priori. It's not after the fact, looking at stuff we can see, but it's before the fact. It begins with an assumption, in other words. We're assuming something, and then we attempt to prove that assumption. So we're assuming that God exists. I'll explain that word in a moment, and then we attempt to prove it. So again, just breaking the word down, the Greek present participle of the verb to be, I.e., ontos, that's the present participle, meaning being or existence, and logos again meaning word or systematic discourse. So ontological means we exist, God exists, and a systematic argument comes to that. And so we need to look at the fact that existential reality is an argument for the existence of God. Now, how does that work? Well, the argument is pretty philosophical, and it's not inductive. The argument goes that if a man could conceive of a perfect, maximally great God who does not exist, because it's all in your imagination, then he could conceive of another being greater than that in your imagination, which is logically impossible because the first one was maximally great. And so what they're saying, in reality, God exists. And Alvin Plantinga restates the argument like this: existence in reality is much greater than anything you can imagine, anything you have in your understanding. So because we do exist, the cosmos exists, we exist, and we have conscience, we have the ability to think and relate to each other. It just shows that God actually exists. Now, that might not be very satisfactory to some of you, and I can assure you it's not been very satisfactory to a lot of people down the centuries. And it rests on the fact that everyone has an awareness of God. And because the concept of God is therefore universal, God must have placed the idea within mankind. And it was Anselm, who lived between 1033 and 1109 AD, was the first to propose the argument. And it's received many criticisms over the centuries, but no one's managed to dismiss it completely. So although it's a difficult argument to understand, the fact of being is very important. Because let me just take a little side explanation. When we look at how we know what we know, we have three stages. First of all, we have ontology, which means being, the facts of the universe, they exist. Then you have epistemology, which is your structure of knowledge based on those facts. Then after that, you get hermeneutics, which is your interpretation of that knowledge based on those facts into your life, your morals, your society, and your culture. So it's ontology, epistemology, and then hermeneutics. And that is the only way you can actually have a sensible, systematic theory of knowledge or a philosophy of life. And so ontology is so basic to everything, and it's difficult to dismiss it, but yet it's so difficult to make it coherent and make it satisfactory. But it's a real thing, and I hope you understand that, you know, we all have difficulty with it, me included, and many more, much more intelligent people than I have done that as well. So carrying on with this argument, many commentators think that it has limited value, and not many would accept its usefulness in bringing people to a saving knowledge of God. So I wouldn't discuss that argument if you are evangelizing. I would leave that to a discussion between mature believers, if you like. That would be much better, because you run into a lot of trouble trying to explain that to an unbeliever. Okay, well, those were the arguments in favor of the existence of God. And we must now look at those which deny the existence of God or provide a substitute. And by the way, I've thrown a lot of information at you right now, so I'm going to slow down just a second. If you have any questions or comments, don't forget, we have the chat room, which you can just put your questions in, and I'll try and answer them at the end. Okay, so moving on, we've looked at the arguments for God's existence, now arguments against it. Well, the first one, obviously, is going to be the atheistic argument, what atheists say. Now, the term atheist comes from the Greek word theos, meaning God, with the prefix a, alpha, which is a negative. A or an is a negative. So it negates the following word. Literally, atheos means no God. So therefore, an atheist is someone who does not believe in God. So that's clear, I think, and that's quite straightforward. Now then, the atheistic argument goes like this. Ephesians 2 verse 12 translates the term theoi as without God to explain the status of unsaved Gentiles in their attitude towards God. So atheoi, like poloi means people, hoi poloi means the people. So atheoi means, or hoi atheoi would be the people without God. So atheists can be placed into three categories. Did you know that? There's three categories. Well, here we are. There's practical atheists, and they live genuinely as if there is no God. They just do what they want. It's their universe, their life, and they do it practically as though there's no God. Two, there's the dogmatic atheist who openly repudiates God, makes a lot of noise and openly challenges the existence of God. And I don't know quite how that affects his life or her life, but it's just a dogma, and they feel they have to argue against the theistic God. So then finally, there's three. The third one, there's a virtual atheist who rejects God by terminology. For example, I don't know whether you've heard of Paul Tillich or not, but I've got his book, Systematic Theology, on my bookshelf, and I could only get to the end of the introduction. I couldn't get any further than that because I rejected his approach completely. He does not believe in the inerrant, inspired word of God. He turns it around to what he thinks. And he's called God, not as the creator God or the absolute God of the universe, but as the ground of all being. And that classification includes all those who deny God, all those who accept God. And in fact, it's a very loose, slippery term. So when you start from there, and that's in the introduction, when you get into systematic theology, what you're trying to define in terms of God's attributes and his being and his character, it becomes a very slippery thing. And because he's one of the seminal theologians which has influenced and colored the rise of liberal theology into our main denominations, you can see now why they actually can't stand on the word of God, because this guy, among others, has actually defined it away into a slippery term that you can't actually nail down. And the more you do that, the less you can understand. So atheists tend to argue from the negative point of view, refusing usually to consider the arguments for the existence of God, frequently citing issues such as the existence of evil in the world as proof of God's non-existence. I'm actually writing a book at the moment, which is called Predestination, Free Will, and the Problem of Evil. And I cover all that in that, and I'm sort of about 2/3 of the way through. And it's a very interesting, difficult proposition to lay out in a logical order, in an understandable order, because it's very, what's the word? It's counter feelings. It goes against your feelings. Your feelings forbid some things, and you look on some of the evil that's happening in the world, and like the genocide you've got in Armenia that's going on, and the ethnic cleansing in Ukraine, and the absolute Holocaust-like stuff that's been happening to Israel, and you look at that and you think, how can God allow that if he was real? And that's a real problem in many people's minds, which is why I felt called to write about it. But anyway, moving on, the atheists have a stubborn refusal to contemplate the existence of God, and it's a spiritual blindness. Actually, it's like Israel; they have the blinkers on the eyes until God decides to take them off. It's spiritual blindness masquerading as rationality. That's what it masquerades as reason, where it is in fact an emotional position. It's not rational, it's not reasoned, it's an emotional position, because they don't engage properly in arguments. When I say arguments, discussions. And so We then come to the agnostic argument. So if I just pause there a second. So the atheists really have an emotional set where they tend to dismiss any coherent arguments for the existence of God, but it's an emotional position. It's not rational, even though they claim it to be intellectual and rationalistic. It's not. It's an emotional thing. And I think the reason for that is they do not want to be accountable to a holy God. That's the real reason, I think. Anyway, agnostics. Well, I'll define the word again. Gnosis means knowledge, accompanied by the prefix a, which is the negative. So therefore, the agnostic literally means one who lacks knowledge of God or has no knowledge. And an agnostic would say that we cannot know if God exists or not because there's no knowledge, no proof of anything. So they sort of try to sit on the fence. And this term was first coined by Sir Thomas Huxley, who was Darwin's bulldog, and he was determined to get away from the straitjacket of Christianity. And as history has shown, he was very successful with his colleagues like Sir Charles Lyell, the father of geology and so on. Anyway, the term was first coined by him, and that was in the 1860s, 1870s. And it has various degrees of skepticism in agnostic people. And they're followers of naturalism. Their belief in something has to be scientifically verifiable, measured, or based on evidence from the natural world, which you can actually get hold of, touch, feel, see, or measure. And since God is not scientifically verifiable, and is not part of the created world, but supernatural, they tend to leave him out of their discussions. And this is a very limited viewpoint, because since all discussion is restrained to the natural world, and they refuse even to discuss any supernatural evidence or argument. And by this, they refuse to accept that there is two parts to our existence. One is the natural, where we walk about, we sleep, we eat, we do all the things that the physical being does. And then the other one is supernatural. It's in our spirit and our soul, and that's the side of us that can relate to God and the afterlife. But they deny that aspect, so all they're left with is nature. So they end up in a closed system and they can't get out of it. And here's one of the great devastating things about that. If we're living in a closed system, nothing can get in or out, right? So if nothing can get in or out, then praying to God is pointless because it can't get out. You see, there's no point in prayer whatsoever. So when you're in the dark times of life, when you're suffering or you're bereaved or anything like that, or you're ill, and you want to cry out to God and pray to him, he's not there to be listened to. And even if he was, it can't get out of this closed system. It is so diabolically evil that I can't express myself strongly enough about it. Anyway, then we come to the evolution argument. Now, evolution is a naturalist approach to life, again in a closed system, and its origins, of course, and it's deductive and a priori, brought to the discussion fully formed. In other words, it's an assumption which they've made beforehand, and now they're trying to prove it. And so they bring that assumption to the discussion fully formed, and again, it's an emotional position. It begins with the premise that there is no God, and it subsequently seeks to establish that life could have occurred without recourse to creative action from any God. This basically goes back to the atheists and the agnostics, and you're making assumptions which you can't prove, but they color the way you think about things. And so you end up in this closed system, which is only, therefore, evil, natural evil, moral evil in a closed system, means there's no point to it. There is no ultimate justice that comes to bear on it later on, when we go to the next life. There's no fairness about anything. There's no point in looking for God's justice or recompense or anything, because it can't exist. The consequences of this viewpoint are really serious. And if God created human beings, let's put it this way, then they're morally responsible beings, responsible and accountable to God. Yes, we all agree with that. If humans are the product of random evolution, then they are only biological machines and not morally responsible for their actions, since the higher authority doesn't exist. And if you add the agnostic argument in as well, even if he did exist, we couldn't reach him or pray to him, because our prayers could not get out of this naturalistic cosmos, closed system. So now we're going to move on from those arguments. So just those are sort of intellectual arguments. Now we're going to look at some real arguments about things like polytheism, that there's more than one God. How does that work? Because we're talking about the existence of the monotheistic Judeo-Christian God, not a pantheon of gods, as they used to have in Arabia and things like that, and still do in India. The term polytheism comes from the Greek word poly, meaning many, and theos, meaning God. So the term means many gods. So I think don't need to belabor that point any further. So history records many nations and cultures that were polytheistic, from simple tribal communities to great civilizations. And the Egyptians worshipped a great many gods, such as the sun, the Nile, frogs, and all sorts of things. So too the Romans, who were also animists. And animism has two aspects, really. The attribution of a living soul to plants, animals, trees, rivers, streams, like the dryads and the hyads and things like that. And all sorts of natural phenomena like earthquakes and thunder and lightning. They give a spiritual aspect to that. It's like a divine occurrence. And the second aspect of animism is the belief in a supernatural power that organizes and animates the material universe. It's a bit like the Force in Star Wars. It permeates everything and tries to organize things. So you've got to trust me, I'm a Jedi. That's a t-shirt I've seen. Trust me, I'm a Jedi. It's a very great thing that's gone into the culture, and that film has damaged many, many young people's understanding of the universe and the fact that God is totally separate, yet he's immanent and he looks after us and so on. But now it's like a force, like a miasma that permeates everything, and people are beginning to think that way. It's a very new age, actually, very difficult. Right, getting towards the end now. So the polytheism argument, the people of India are both polytheistic and pantheistic. We'll deal with pantheism in a moment. And underneath the veneer of Hindu religion, ancient animism is a very strong influence. I think something's gone wrong there, but never mind. The term pantheism comes from the Greek word pan, meaning all, and theos, meaning God. So the term pantheism means that all or everything is God, and God is everything. God is all, and all is God. That's what it means. And God in the Bible denies that. He's holy, and he's separate. In fact, that's what holy means. It means completely other, separate. That's why we are called the holy ones, the hagioi, or the saints. We are also separate because we take God's point of view. Now, Seneca, the Roman philosopher, said, what is God? He is all that you see and all that you do not see. So he's a pantheist, effectively. And there are different forms of pantheism. Materialistic pantheism, David Strauss holds to this, which holds to the eternity of matter, and that matter is the cause of all life. So God didn't create, matter's existed forever, no end and no beginning. And that's very similar to Hinduism, which says the universe is eternal. Then there's hylozoism, but you can't pronounce that, hylozoism. The Greek word zoe means spiritual life. It's a modern form of pantheism held by Leibniz, the great philosopher, which holds that all matter has a principle of life or psychical properties. It's very interesting, isn't it? And there's neutralism, which says that life is neutral, neither mind nor matter. I don't know what that means. I know it exists and some people hold to it, but I don't understand what they mean or what the actual position means in effect in people's lives. Neutral, is it? And then 4, there's idealism, which says that ultimate reality is really mind, either individual mind or infinite mind. And you can see that's probably the basis of that film trilogy, The Matrix, where we're all part of a computer program and all somebody's imagination. And so again, I don't know how people can get to that, because if you hit your thumb with a hammer, it hurts. It really does. It's not an imagined thing. So I don't understand neutralism or idealism, but they are real things. And finally, then there's philosophical mysticism, which is absolute monism, teaching that all reality is one or a unity. Monism means singular or one. Very similarly meaning to solo. The monism argument, it's a view that attributes oneness or singleness, the Greek monos, to a concept, that is existence. And various kinds of monism can be distinguished. Now, don't ask me how they come up with these ideas. I've done the research. These ideas are discussed in theological academia. I'm going to go through it so that I make sure that you understand these things. But I don't think you need to worry about it, really. First one is priority monism. It states that all existing things go back to a source that is distinct from them. That is, like in Neoplatonism, everything is derived from the one. Like if you look at a chair, there's lots of different styles of chair, but there's one perfect chair in heaven from which all other chairs are derived. It's that kind of monism. In this view, only one thing is ontologically basic. You understand that word there? Or prior to everything else, and that's the ideal chair in heaven, as my example. The second one is the existence monism, and that proposes that, strictly speaking, there exists only a single thing, that is the universe, which can only be artificially and arbitrarily divided into many things in your mind, basically. So there's only one thing, and you shouldn't really try to divide it up. And then substance monism asserts that a variety of existing things can be explained in terms of a single reality or substance. And it proposes that only one kind of stuff, either matter or mind, exists, although many things be made out of this stuff, this substance. And again, I think when people start discussing these things and making these things up, I don't know where they're coming from, but to me, none of this really accords with the reality of God's existence and the way we live on earth. But these are the theological arguments against the existence of God. Then there's the deism argument. The term deism comes from Latin this time, not Greek. Deus meaning God, and it's a completely different view of God from theism. And deists believe that there is no personal God to whom mankind can relate. He's an impersonal God. He created the world and afterwards divorced himself from the human race and left mankind alone in this created world. In other words, we're back to the closed system again. And deists accept only the transcendence of God, that is, he's completely separate. They reject his immanence. They reject the fact that he's actually in the world and his providence is operating at all times. So in conclusion then, we've eventually got there. This concludes our brief overview of all the anti-theistic views of God, arguments put forward by philosophers since the earliest times. And these arguments come from the mind of man and not from the revelation of God. And they inherently deny the supernatural aspects of existence and life as we know it, and the revealed fact that God sustains life in the entire biosphere, including that of mankind. And as you can read Job chapter 12, verses 9 and 10, chapter 33, verse 4, John chapter 6, verse 63, and Acts chapter 17, verse 25. I've come to the end of my time, so you'll have to look those references up yourself, but I do encourage you to do that. And having examined all the arguments for the existence of God, we must now define God, and this we should do first by considering the possibility of the knowledge of God. So this is the question: can we know God, and if so, how? And I'm stopping there, and that is something we will address next week, how we can know God. Having looked at the existence of him and all the arguments for and against, I'm quite convinced that the arguments for his existence are the right ones. They actually carry the force. They carry the argument completely. The atheistic arguments are all man-made philosophies, made up stuff from an emotion that denies they want to be accountable to a holy God who will hold you accountable. So I think that's the reason. So next time we come, next week, we will look at this question of knowledge of God.